So the title of my talk is Crypto for the People Part 2, and this is a follow-up to a keynote I gave at Crypto in 2020. So the original talk was motivated by protests that were going on at the time due to the killings of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery. And the talk was really a critique about computer science as a whole, but cryptography in particular. And one of the points that I tried to make was that while it was clear to me that industry, government, and venture capitalists benefit from our work, including my work, what was less clear to me is whether regular people, and in particular people from marginalized communities, benefit from our work. And so in the talk, I gave some examples of projects that I felt were in line with this, right? Or projects that I felt benefited people from marginalized communities. But I also thought it would be important to give examples of projects that I don't feel achieve this, right? And one of the examples that I gave was a project of the forum, this blockchain is going to solve longstanding developmental issues and unlock much needed economic growth in rural communities in Africa, right? And this happens to be a real project, actually. Like I didn't make it up. So yeah, so I gave the talk and I got a lot of email after the talk, which was great. That started a lot of really interesting conversations with a lot of folks. But I also got emails about projects that I didn't find, as great. And one example was a project where somebody was trying to explain to me how blockchain could be used to tackle the problem of police violence, right? And and this sort of was confusing because it was almost exactly what I said I didn't want to hear about. But of course, like the way that this happens is that if you take imagine your favorite cryptographer Bob, right? And Bob likes fancy cryptography. So Bob likes blockchain and like encrypted search, which is the area that I work in indistinguishable obfuscation and fully homomorphic encryption, right? So Bob likes these fancy these fancy crypto technologies. But of course, Bob also notices that people are talking about police violence and like sexual assault and bias and discrimination, misinformation. And so, right, Bob puts two and two together and thinks, hey, like, I know what I'll do. I'll use cryptography to solve police violence, right? And like, so why is this a problem, right? This is a problem because Bob isn't really interested in the social problem. Bob is interested in the crypto problem that he claims is motivated by the social problem. And while the technical problem, while the crypto problem is maybe fun, right? It doesn't really address the actual social issue, right? And so essentially what's happening is that Bob has a hammer and is looking for a social nail, right? And of course, like Bob isn't the only person doing this. Companies do this all the time. So this is the front page of the DM project. So if you remember, Facebook started a cryptocurrency called Libra a few years ago, and this is like some version or iteration of that project. And when I saw this, I was really surprised because presumably this is a woman from West Africa, and my family is from West Africa, and I never knew that Facebook was so interested in or cared so much about West Africa, about its people, its cultures, and its economies, but apparently it is, right? And of course, I think most of us can see through this, right? Most of us understand that like the Libra project was probably not started, like the reason that Facebook started the Libra project probably wasn't because of developing nations, right? Like that wasn't the original motivation. But of course, when you're trying to sell something that people don't want and that people view as a power grab, then using marginalized groups and developing nations as branding is a great way to seem sincere, right? And to seem altruistic, right? So, and this is basically what's happening, right? So like, it's great to want to address social problems, but often what people are actually doing is they're using marginalized communities or they're using social problems as branding, right? And this is why we get all of these narratives in tech, like cryptocurrencies for developing countries and fintech for the unbanked and AI teachers and chatbots for poor and underserved areas, right? So instead of giving people actually more teachers, right, we're gonna just like have them educated by a chatbot. So, you know, this is sort of this is pretty common. So what should Bob do, right? If Bob genuinely cares about a social problem, then in my opinion, Bob should work with experts on that problem, right? This means experts in the social sciences and the humanities who have the technical kind of background to understand the problem in its entirety, but also should work with experts who have lived experience, right? People who have actually been affected by these problems and who have experienced them. And this is really, really important, right? Like, and you know, if you've ever been through something traumatic, for example, right, you'll probably like what you probably notice is that there's a lot of details and a lot of nuances that you never would have predicted and that you never would have anticipated, and that people who haven't been through it just don't know, right? And these little details and nuances are really, really important. They really matter. And oftentimes they're actually like, unfortunately, they can be part of the worst part of that experience. And so working with people with lived experience is crucial because they know these details, right? The details that matter, the nuances that matter. They understand the psychological state of the people that are involved, right? In these, like, that are dealing with this. They understand the broader context as well, right? So this is very, very important. So the number one thing, or the first thing that Bob should do is Bob should be collaborating, right? There should be some kind of teamwork happening with experts, and those experts are the ones that are going to know. So both academic and experts with lived experience, and those experts are going to know which assumptions make sense and which don't, right? They're going to know of the real world constraints that Bob just can't really fathom, right? They're going to understand the human and the psychological dimensions of the problem. They're going to know which risks are tolerable and which risks aren't. And crucially, they're also going to be able to see potential harms that Bob isn't able to see, or Bob isn't equipped to see. Okay. So so Bob should work with experts, but also it's also important that Bob focuses on designing what the experts believe is useful, not what he thinks is useful. Okay. And that should be the case, even if the technology, or the crypto in this case, is boring, right? The point of this work isn't like technical innovation, right? That's not the goal. That's not the point. The point is hopefully to play some part in addressing a problem, right, that affects people, right? Like that's the goal. So, okay, now I want to talk about a little bit about a project that we did at Brown that was related to a social problem, and use that to discuss some of the challenges in doing this kind of work. So, unfortunately, gun violence is a problem that affects everybody. Affects people all around the world, and it affects Americans as well, right? So 36,000 Americans are killed by guns every year, 100,000 are injured. 600 women are shot and killed by an intimate partner every year. 4.5 million women are threatened with a gun every year. Black people are 10 times more likely to be killed with a gun, and Black men account for 52% of gun deaths. Okay. And we've also seen how there's been an epidemic of mass shootings in the US, and these occur everywhere, right? They've happened at movie theaters and concerts, universities, elementary schools, and grocery stores, right? Now, the problem of gun violence is a really complicated one, right? Like, obviously, this is not going to be solved by technology. That would be absurd, right? Gun violence is a hugely complex issue. And one of the things that make it, one of the many things that make it so complicated is gun control laws. And so I'm not going to go over gun control laws in the US because I just don't have time, but I will just highlight the Firearm Owner Protection Act of 1986, which one of the things that it does is that it prohibits the federal government and state governments from requiring gun registration. Okay. So how did this project start? So basically in early 2019, Senator Wyden's staff reached out to us, and they were working on a bill that would allow for a form of some approximation of a national gun registry, but it would be a voluntary system and it would be completely decentralized. And the fact that it's voluntary and decentralized is very important here, right? There's a lot of like legal design happening in this bill. And so they were working with very like specific constraints. And so they came to us because one of the things that was important for what they had in mind was that the registrations would be stored in databases that were end-to-end encrypted and controlled by a local official, right? And that in particular, the federal government and state governments would never be able to see this data because it was encrypted. And another important constraint was that the local officials should be able to pull their data at any time, right? And so like these two constraints here that I highlighted with the red symbol, these are like subtle things that we would have had no idea about, right? And these were part, and the only reason why we knew about them is because these were like very, very specific things that the senator's staff put in the design, right? In their legal sort of design. So after talking with them, what we did is, you know, we took the legislation and we generated a set of technical requirements from that. And then we designed a cryptographic protocol to support what they needed or what they were asking for. And then we implemented a prototype and we evaluated it. And, you know, I'm not going to bore you with the technical details of the project. You can read about them in the paper if you're interested. But the point I do want to make is that at the end, you know, what we were able to demonstrate is that it was possible to design such a thing and that it was possible to run at the scale of the US, right? And another question that they had is how much would something like this cost roughly, right? And so we were able to estimate that it would cost about $100,000 a year. So, right. So one of the things I want to highlight about this project is that this really was a collaboration, right? Like we worked with the senator's staff from beginning to end, right? And really like the design of, you know, the technical requirements were really derived from the legal requirements, which were designed by Senator White and staff, right? So everything was based on the legislation and we worked according to their constraints and we prioritized their needs and the trade-offs that they felt were reasonable, right? And anytime we made an assumption, we went back to them and had them vet the assumption, right? And this is sort of the style of work or the way of collaborating that I think is necessary for these kinds of projects. Okay, so next I want to talk about some of the challenges involved in this work. So there are several challenges, and one of them is the peer review process. There's just no way around this, right? So one of the reviews that we got is the following. So it said the use of MPC is a particular crypto technology that we used. So it said the use of MPC demanded by the functionality of the system as a whole is not very novel. The authors use encrypted databases in a rather black box way. I wonder if there is some scope to significantly strengthen the paper to consider a narrow implementation of some of these primitives that are scoped only to this particular problem, right? So the main keywords here are like lack of novelty, the fact that we reuse other work or that we reuse encrypted databases in a black box way, right, et cetera, et cetera. Now, if you've ever submitted a paper for publication and you get reviews, you know that this is like every paper gets this review roughly, right? Like nothing is novel to reviewers. But obviously we disagree, right? We felt like there was a ton of novelty in the paper, technical novelty in the paper, but it doesn't even matter, right? Like that wasn't even the point. Like even if there was like no novelty, technical novelty in the paper, like who cares, right? The goal of the paper was to use our expertise to solve a new technical problem motivated by a social problem, right? That experts asked us to solve under the constraints that they laid out and based on assumptions that they vetted, right? The goal of the project is not to impress reviewer number 2 or anybody else with how smart we are, right? So this is sort of an important distinction. But if you're going to do this kind of work, unfortunately, you're just going to have to deal with this kind of review. But you know, hopefully, with time, in time, reviewers will be able to distinguish, you know, what's important, right? So another issue was related to incentives. So this project had no funding, right? Like senators don't have funding for research. And but this was actually a relatively large team. There was one associate professor, which was myself, a postdoc, a PhD student, and two master's students, and it took about 2 years, right? And the traditional funding sources, aren't going to fund this work. Like the National Science Foundation, right? The turnaround time for the NSF is much larger than what we had. We had to start working on the project right away. And honestly, like, NSF funding, like few people get it, and it's usually focused on kind of more trendy problems and trendy areas, right? DARPA and IARPA funding is focused on government and military needs, and industry funding is focused on industry needs and trends, right? So this is a real challenge because, like, you may not know this, but if you're a faculty member, you don't get paid for 12 months out of the year. You get paid a 9-month salary. That's it. For the rest of your salary, you need to get funding, right? For you to receive the remainder of your salary. And you need that funding also to support your PhD students and postdocs. And so if you're going to take on one of these projects, which has no funding, and you're going to spend 2 years with a full team on it, right? You're going to take a hit, right? Your salary, your personal salary is going to take a hit. And that's just, unfortunately, that's part of the current system, right? Unless we have better funding sources for this kind of research, which we need. So another issue is that when we started the project, we knew, or we assumed that the protocol and the system that we were going to design and build would likely never be used, right? The idea of a national gun registry is a political third rail in the US. We knew that the legislation might not even ever come out. And we knew that the timing of the legislation and also the timing of our work, when we were going to be able to talk about it, was going to be subject to the political landscape, right? It was going to be dependent on what was going on, right? Like in the news cycles, what was going to be going on politically, all of those things, right? All of those things could have an impact on whether our research would ever come out. We also knew there was basically no opportunity to claim real world impact, which for people who are doing applied work is important, right? It helps with tenure and it helps with funding. So it was clear to us that our work would have basically no industry impact, no financial impact, and would be very unlikely to have any practical real world impact, right? That it would actually be running. So why did we do it, right? We still felt it was worthwhile because our hope was that it would have maybe policy impact, right? Like we know that gun violence is one of the most important social problems in the US, that gun control is one of the most intractable policy problems in the US, and that the privacy of gun owners is a crucial element of this debate. And so our hope was that maybe our work in some small part would help remove this concern and then maybe help change the debate even a little bit, right? But the reality is that, like, even though this was important to us, right, there was really there weren't really any like practical incentives to do it, right? Not the way that the current incentives are structured for professors, PhD students, and postdocs. Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about is education, because I do think that it plays its part here. So one of the things that I hope is clear is that, to most people would agree with, is that since the 2000s or the 2010s, technology is impacting people directly, right? Things like, of course, machine learning and automated decision making, social networks, the fact that all our communications are digital, the erosion of privacy, et cetera, right? Clearly, technology is impacting people's lives, like, directly, okay? This is very different than what happened in the past, right? Up until the 90s or maybe the early 2000s, should I probably say the 90s, right? It was, the general thought was that technology and computer science didn't really impact people, right? It had some impact, but it was an indirect impact, right? And so because of this, computer science education, right, was designed really to, or I wouldn't say it was designed, but most computer science curriculums, right, completely ignored people, right? Most computer science curriculums were just like 90% or 100% STEM, right? And that was it, right? And if you were educated in the 90s, like I was, right, like hopefully you agree to this, right? And so the computer science education that we currently have, right, it values STEM over everything else. It prizes technical prowess over critical thinking, and it trains students exclusively to solve quantitative problems, right? But the problem is that social problems are not well-posed problems, right? They don't have an optimal solution, and they span many fields that have nothing to do with STEM. And in particular, like STEM education, right? It teaches you how to solve technical problems. It teaches you how to solve well-posed problems, right? On the other hand, educate like social science and humanities classes, they teach you how to solve and how to think about fuzzy problems, right? Problems that don't necessarily have a solution, problems of a more philosophical nature, right? And this is a really crucial and important skill set to have. And so if we look at like the classical computer science student, right? The one that like we've put on a pedestal like since forever, right? It's the student that takes like programming, operating systems, compilers, networking, machine learning, AI, and computer vision, right? It takes electrical engineering and probability theory and linear algebra and complexity theory and algorithms, biochemistry, et cetera, right? And that built their own operating system like by the time they were a third year undergrad. Okay. But the problem is that like as I said, computer science and technology, right, have undergone a massive shift where now they're impacting people directly. And so the students that are being produced with this sort of classical view of computer science are not really equipped to tackle the new problems that are coming up now. And so we need a different kind of student, right? We need a student that has like, in addition to the STEM skills, also has really like real critical thinking skills, right? And so these are just some examples of classes that are offered at Brown that I think are actually relevant, right, to a computer science student that is graduating today, right? Classes like ethnographic research methods, introduction to social psychology, methods of social research, history of capitalism, right? Our students are graduating and going into industry, right? They should understand like how capitalism works and what's going on, right? Like modern genocide, right? We know that like, for example, Facebook has played its part in the genocide in Myanmar, right? From Freud to QAnon is another class, right? We know that social networks and technology are, increasing misinformation, right? So these are just some examples. But I do think it's really important, right? I think it's crucial that the students that we produce start to have a more well-rounded and balanced education, like beyond STEM. And I think if we're able to do that, then I think a lot of the projects that are socially relevant, right? That we try to tackle. I'm not necessarily saying that like we'll be able to solve those problems, but I think we'll have technologists and computer scientists that are better equipped to help solve at least some small fraction of those problems. Okay. And yeah, that's pretty much all I had. So thank you.